The telephone rings in the silence of a darkened house and pierces the quiet atmosphere with its shrill mechanical sound. A teenage girl sits alone in a stranger's living room and answers the call, expecting to hear the parents checking in or perhaps a friend playing a prank. Instead, she hears a sinister voice on the other end, asking a question that chills her to the bone. Have you checked the children? This specific scenario has played out in countless slumber parties and campfire stories across the United States for decades. It is the quintessential urban legend known as the babysitter and the man upstairs. The story always ends with a terrifying revelation from the police operator. The calls are coming from inside the house. But where did this story originate? And is there a grain of truth buried beneath the layers of folklore? Most people assume this tale is purely a fabrication designed to frighten young women into being vigilant while watching other people's children. The narrative taps into a primal fear of home invasion and the vulnerability of being responsible for the safety of others in an unfamiliar environment. However, the boundary between folklore and reality is often thinner than we would like to believe. While the specific detail of the call coming from a second line inside the house was popularized by films like Black Christmas, and When a Stranger Calls, there are real-life cases that bear a haunting resemblance to the legend. One such case took place in the quiet college town of Columbia, Missouri, in the middle of the 20th century. It was a crime so shocking that it may have planted the seed for the nightmare that has haunted babysitters ever since. The year was 1950, and the setting was a post-war America defined by a sense of safety and suburban expansion. Columbia, Missouri was a wholesome community where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors implicitly. It was the kind of place where a violent crime against a child seemed like an impossibility. On a crisp evening in March, the illusion of safety in this Midwestern town would be shattered forever. The events of that night would not only devastate a local family, but would also echo through history as one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in the state. We must transport ourselves back to that era to understand the context of a crime that remains open on the books to this day. Janett Christman was a bright and responsible 13-year-old girl who was well-liked by her peers and trusted by the adults in her community. She was a student at Jefferson Junior High School and had a reputation for being mature beyond her years. Janett often took babysitting jobs to earn extra money, and she was known to be reliable and attentive. On the night of March 18, 1950, she accepted a job looking after the young son of Ed and Gregory Romack. The Romacks were a well-known family in town, and they lived in a modest single-story house on West Broadway. Janett had babysitted for them before and felt comfortable in their home. Nothing about the arrangement seemed unusual or dangerous when she arrived that evening. The Romack residence was situated on a somewhat isolated lot, surrounded by open fields and the darkness of the rural outskirts. The house itself was typical of the era, with a layout that included a living room, a kitchen, and bedrooms down a hallway. It was a chilly night, with wind whistling through the bare trees outside. Mr. and Mrs. Romack were heading out to a card party at a friend's house and expected to be gone for several hours. They gave Janett instructions on when to feed the baby and when to put him to bed. As they left the house around 7:30 that evening, they had no way of knowing it would be the last time they would see their trusted babysitter alive. The door clicked shut, and Janett was left alone with the sleeping infant. For the first few hours, the evening likely passed without incident. Janett would have attended to the baby and perhaps done some homework or listened to the radio. The atmosphere in the house would have been quiet save for the ticking of a clock or the settling of the foundation. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the darkness pressed against the window panes. In 1950, There were no cell phones or internet distractions. A babysitter was truly isolated once the homeowners left. We can imagine Janett sitting in the living room, illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp, unaware that she was being watched or that someone was planning to breach the sanctuary of the home. The isolation of the Ramek house made it an easy target for someone with malicious intent. The pivotal moment in this tragedy occurred later in the evening around 10:35. Officer Roy McCown of the Columbia Police Department was on duty at the station when the phone rang. He picked up the receiver and heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a girl screaming in sheer terror. The voice was high-pitched and hysterical, crying out words that sounded like "come quick." The scream was followed by a sharp gasp, and then the line went dead. There was no address given and no name provided. In 1950, emergency tracing technology did not exist in the way it does today. Officer McCown was left staring at the silent receiver, knowing that someone was in mortal danger, but having no idea where to send help. Officer McCown desperately tried to keep the line open, hoping the caller would return, but there was only silence. He alerted his colleagues, but without a location, their hands were tied. They could not dispatch a patrol car to every house in Columbia. The police were forced to wait and hope that another call would come through, or that a neighbor would report a disturbance. Meanwhile, back at the Ramek residence, a horrific scene had played out in a matter of moments. The scream heard by Officer McCown was likely Janett's final desperate attempt to summon help as her attacker closed in. The timing suggests that the intruder had already gained access to the house and disconnected the call or incapacitated Janett before she could provide her location. The Rameks returned home shortly after 1:30 in the morning, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. As Ed Ramek approached the front door, he noticed that the porch light was on, which was not unusual. However, when he tried to unlock the front door, he found it was already unlocked. He pushed the door open and stepped into the living room. The sight that greeted him was one of absolute carnage. The room was in disarray, and Janett Christman lay on the floor in a pool of blood. She had been brutally attacked. The shock was immediate and paralyzing. Gregory Ramek rushed to check on their baby son, who was miraculously unharmed in his crib, sleeping peacefully through the violence that had occurred just rooms away. Ed Ramek immediately called the police, and the authorities rushed to the scene on West Broadway. When they arrived, they confirmed that the victim was indeed the 13-year-old babysitter Janett Christman. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been bludgeoned and strangled. The weapon appeared to be a blunt object, perhaps a lamp base or an iron, although the exact item was a matter of debate. What made the crime scene particularly chilling was the lack of forced entry. The windows were intact, and the locks on the doors had not been picked or broken. This detail led investigators to a disturbing conclusion. Either Janett had opened the door for her killer, or the killer was already inside the house waiting for the right moment to strike. Investigators combed the house for clues. They found that a window in the kitchen was unlocked, but it had a screen that appeared undisturbed. The more likely scenario was that Janett knew her attacker. The Ramek family dog, a terrier who was known to bark at strangers, had been silent throughout the night. This detail strongly suggested that the intruder was someone familiar to the dog, and likely familiar to Janett as well. The absence of a struggle at the entry points pointed to a betrayal of trust. The killer had walked right in, or had been let in by a victim who did not perceive an immediate threat until it was too late. This element aligns perfectly with the urban legend, where the danger is closer than the victim realizes. The police investigation quickly focused on a prime suspect named Robert Mueller. Mueller was a friend of the Ramek family, and he knew Janett Christman. He was a 27-year-old man who worked at a local clothing store. Mueller had visited the Romack house frequently and was familiar with the layout and the dog. On the night of the murder, Mueller had been at a party nearby. Witnesses reported that he left the party for a significant period of time, which coincided with the estimated time of the attack and the phone call to the police station. When questioned, Mueller claimed he had gone out to buy cigarettes, but his alibi was shaky and inconsistent. He became the primary focus of Sheriff Glenn Powell and the Columbia Police Department. Despite the circumstantial evidence linking Mueller to the crime, the case faced significant hurdles. In 1950, forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA testing to link Mueller to the scene. Fingerprint analysis was available, but yielded no definitive matches that could pin the murder solely on him. The police relied heavily on witness testimony and motive, neither of which was strong enough to secure a conviction. Mueller was brought in for questioning multiple times and even took a lie detector test, which produced inconclusive results. The community was convinced of his guilt, but the legal system required more proof than what the investigators could provide. The case against Mueller stalled, leaving the town in a state of fear and frustration. One of the most perplexing details of the crime scene was the telephone. The receiver was found dangling off the hook. This confirmed that Janett had indeed tried to make a call during the attack. The fact that the line was kept open meant that anyone trying to call the house would have received a busy signal. This detail adds a layer of tragedy to the story, as the lifeline to the outside world was severed. The cord of the phone was not cut, which differs from some versions of the urban legend, but the outcome was the same. Janett was cut off from help. The image of the receiver hanging by its cord became a symbol of the helplessness experienced by the victim and the failure of the authorities to save her. The investigation revealed another chilling detail regarding the layout of the house. The Romack residence had a guest bedroom that was rarely used. Some investigators speculated that the killer could have entered the house earlier in the day and hidden in that room or a closet waiting for the parents to leave. This theory aligns terrifyingly well with the man upstairs trope of the urban legend. If the killer was indeed hiding inside the house, it would explain the lack of forced entry and the element of surprise. Janett would have been completely unaware that she was not alone until the killer emerged from the shadows. This possibility transformed the crime from a break-in to a calculated ambush. Sheriff Glenn Powell was deeply affected by the case and remained convinced of Mueller's guilt until his dying day. He kept the file on his desk for years, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. The lack of justice for Janett Christman weighed heavily on the community. Rumors swirled about a cover-up or police incompetence, but the reality was likely just the limitations of the era. Without physical evidence placing Mueller at the scene with absolute certainty, the prosecutor felt he could not win the case in court. A grand jury was convened, but they did not return an indictment. Robert Mueller remained a free man living in the same community, where he was suspected of murdering a child. The murder of Janett Christman had a profound impact on the psyche of Columbia, Missouri. People began locking their doors and looking at their neighbors with suspicion. The innocence of the town was lost. Babysitting, which had been a casual way for teenagers to earn money, became a source of anxiety for parents and sitters alike. The story of the girl who was murdered, while babysitting spread by word of mouth, evolving and changing as it traveled. Details were exaggerated and new elements were added. The screaming phone call became a taunting voice. The friend of the family became a stranger. The unlocked door became a killer hiding upstairs. The reality of the crime morphed into the folklore we know today. It is widely believed by folklorists and true crime historians that the Janett Christman case served as a primary inspiration for the urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs. The core elements are all present. A young girl alone in a house at night. A phone call to the police. A killer who strikes when the victim is most vulnerable. While the film When a Stranger Calls popularized the specific line about the call coming from inside the house, the emotional core of the story is rooted in the tragic death of Janett. The legend serves as a cautionary tale, a warning to young women to be vigilant, and to society to protect its most vulnerable members. The connection between the Christman murder and the urban legend highlights how society processes collective trauma. We take real horrors and turn them into stories that we can control. In the legend, the babysitter sometimes escapes, or the police arrive just in time. We rewrite the ending to give ourselves hope or to emphasize the lesson. In reality, Janett Christman did not escape. The police did not arrive in time. The killer was never brought to justice. The fact is far more terrifying than the fiction, because in the real world, there is not always a resolution. The monster does not always get caught, and the victim does not always survive. Over the decades, the case has been revisited by journalists and amateur sleuths. New theories have emerged, including the possibility of other suspects or a botched burglary. However, the focus always returns to Robert Mueller. His behavior after the murder was described as erratic, and he allegedly made incriminating statements to friends. Yet without concrete proof, these remain nothing more than hearsay. The case is officially cold, and with the passage of time, the likelihood of it ever being solved is virtually non-existent. The witnesses are gone, the evidence has degraded, and the secrets of that night have been taken to the grave. The legacy of the Janett Christman case extends beyond the borders of Missouri. It is a grim reminder of the dangers that can lurk in familiar places. The image of the babysitter alone in the house has become a cultural archetype, representing innocence threatened by an unseen evil. The story has been retold in books, movies, and television shows, each iteration adding a new layer of fear. But beneath the entertainment value lies the tragic reality of a 13-year-old girl whose life was stolen. We must remember that behind every urban legend there is often a real victim whose story deserves to be told with respect and accuracy. Comparing the legend to the facts reveals interesting discrepancies. In the legend, the killer taunts the victim with multiple calls, increasing the tension. In the Christman case, there was likely only one call, and it was a desperate plea for help, not a conversation with the killer. The legend often features a stranger who has broken in, while the Christman case points to someone known to the victim who entered without force. The fiction sensationalizes the horror, while the fact highlights the betrayal. The fear in the legend comes from the unknown outsider, while the fear in the Christman case comes from the danger of the acquaintance, the person we think we can trust. The psychological impact of the man upstairs trope is powerful because it violates the sanctity of the home. The home is supposed to be a fortress, a place of safety. To think that an intruder could be inside watching and waiting destroys that sense of security. Whether the killer was actually hiding upstairs in the Romack house or simply walked through the front door, the effect is the same. The sanctuary was breached. This violation is what resonates with audiences and keeps the legend alive. It plays on our fear of being watched when we think we are alone, and the terror of realizing that safety is an illusion. In recent years, true crime enthusiasts have digitized the files and shared the story of Janett Christman with a new generation. Online forums discuss the evidence and debate the guilt of Robert Mueller. This renewed interest ensures that Janett is not forgotten. While the legal system may have failed her, the court of public opinion continues to deliberate. The story serves as a case study, in how unsolved crimes become part of our cultural fabric. It demonstrates the human need to find answers and to make sense of senseless violence even decades after the fact. The house on West Broadway still stands today, a silent witness to the tragedy of 1950. It has been renovated and occupied by other families over the years, but the history remains. For those who know the story, passing by the house evokes a sense of unease. It is a physical reminder of the night the town lost its innocence. The wind still blows through the trees, and the streetlights still flicker, casting long shadows. It is easy to imagine the scene from 70 years ago: the police car pulling up, the frantic parents, and the shattered life of a young girl. We must also consider the role of technology in the evolution of the legend. In 1950, the telephone was a lifeline, but also a tool of terror. The killer could cut the line or use it to taunt. Today, with smartphones and instant connectivity, the dynamics have changed, but the fear remains. We can track locations and call for help instantly, yet we still feel vulnerable. The legend adapts to the times, but the core fear is timeless. It is the fear of isolation and the presence of a predator. The technology changes, but the predator remains the same. The Janett Christman murder is a stark example of how true crime influences pop culture. The writers of horror films often draw inspiration from real headlines, blending details from various cases to create a compelling narrative. The babysitter murder trope is perhaps the most famous example of this. It speaks to the universal experience of adolescence, the first taste of responsibility, and the fear of the adult world. Janett was on the cusp of adulthood, taking on a grown-up role when she was cut down. Her story resonates because she represents every teenager who has ever felt a twinge of fear while alone in a dark house. As we analyze the facts versus the fiction, we are left with a disturbing conclusion. The urban legend allows us to distance ourselves from the horror. It is just a story, a movie, a campfire tale. But the reality of the Janett Christman case forces us to confront the brutality of human nature. There was no script, no director, and no happy ending. There was only a terrified girl and a violent killer. The fact that the killer likely walked free adds a layer of injustice that fiction rarely tolerates. In stories, the bad guy is caught. In reality, he often blends back into the crowd. The mystery of who killed Janett Christman may never be solved definitively. The name Robert Mueller will always be associated with the crime, but without a conviction, it remains an allegation. Other theories suggest a drifter or a burglar surprised in the act, but the evidence for these is scant. The ambiguity is part of what keeps the case alive. If it had been solved quickly and neatly, it might have faded into history. Instead, it remains an open wound, a puzzle with missing pieces. This lack of closure fuels the legend and ensures that the story is retold again and again. Ultimately, the story of the babysitter and the man upstairs is a testament to the power of storytelling to process fear. We tell the story to warn each other, to prepare ourselves, and to try to control the uncontrollable. But we must never lose sight of the real tragedy that lies at its heart. Janett Christman was not a character in a movie. She was a daughter, a student, and a young woman with a future. Her death was a brutal reality that shattered a community. When we tell the ghost story, we are in a way keeping her memory alive, even if the details have been blurred by time.